Hello, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I am Shannon Vasconcellos, and this is my first day hosting this podcast. I don't want anyone to panic. Sally, Ian, and Beth will still be rotating in on hosting duty, but they're adding me to the mix, at least for today. We'll see how today goes. Maybe my first and last occasions of hosting duty, but I hope not. For those of you who don't know me, I am one of the college finance experts here at Bright Horizons College Coach. I'm also a former financial aid officer at Boston University and Tufts University. So I've been on the show actually a lot to chime in with the finance perspective with our wonderful admissions hosts and guests. But today I'm taking over and we'll see how this goes. You might know me the most from our listener questions segments, which are my favorite segments. I didn't want to give those up. So we are actually tackling listener questions later on in the show. But for now, for our first segment, we're going to be discussing letters of recommendation that you may need to get as part of the college admissions process. And joining me to share her expertise is the wonderful Lisa Albro. She is a longtime colleague of mine, also former college counselor at a couple of high schools, I believe, former admissions officer at Goucher College. So tons of great experience to bring to this subject. So welcome, Lisa.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here on your inaugural, I'm sure the first of many, hosting.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the vote of confidence. That's what I need today. So I guess to start with the very basics, I believe there are two different types of recommendations that may come into play in the college admissions office. Letters of recommendation from a counselor and from a teacher or more than one teacher. Does everybody need to do both? Will every college require both types of recommendations?
Not necessarily. In fact, there are some colleges that require none, believe it or not. Yeah. So you may have to provide 0 recommendations to some schools, just a counselor recommendation to some schools, a counselor and a teacher to other schools, and maybe a counselor and 2 teachers to some other schools. So that, as with almost anything in college admissions, and I'm sure in many cases college finance, you can't just make one statement and have it stick for all schools, because there will always be anomalies. There will always be some schools that do things their own way or with their own systems that are a little bit different. So in saying that, I just want everybody to know that it's their job, all students and parents guiding their students, their job to know for sure for each of the schools you're planning to apply to, how many letters of recommendation do they need and who do they need them from.
Got it. And how would a student know that information? Is that on the admissions website?
Yeah, the admissions websites of pretty much every school. Some are a little bit more user-friendly than others. Usually, if you look up application requirements, they'll spell out all the different things that you need. And one of those things or 2 of those things might be letters of recommendation.
Got it. And so what is it that letters of recommendation I find are kind of an interesting part of this process, because it's, most of your application, you as a student control. It's you're filling out the COMAB, you're writing the essay, you've taken the exams, you're deciding if you're submitting test scores or not. The letter of recommendation is sort of one aspect that you don't totally control as a student. Somebody else is doing it. You don't get to control what they put in that letter. But what is the purpose that these recommendations serve? Why is it that the colleges who ask for them, why do they ask for them?
Sure. Well, they want to get perspective of professionals who have been teaching and guiding students. They want to understand who are these people in your perspective. What are some of their strengths? What makes them good potential for college success? What are some of the ways you've seen them stand out or distinguish themselves? And I can split it in 2. And I think this might be a question. I might be jumping ahead on one of your questions, but so the counselor perspective is meant to help understand or help the reader understand who that student is in the context of his class or school school. And the teacher's perspective is to help the reader understand who that student is in the context of that particular classroom.
Right.
or
I
and
got it.
subject maybe even, but in, so it's a narrower perspective in a way, but at the same
Right.
time it's a much more focused, it's more specific to that student's strengths in that teacher's purview, right? The teacher's job is not to talk about all the other things the student does. It's to say, this is what I'm observing as I've been teaching with the student for the past year, or maybe the past several years, who knows how long. And this is where this person has stood out for me, or this is something this student did really, really well. Or this is something they
Yeah.
did that really impressed me, or this was an insight they shared. Let me give an anecdote. Usually teacher recommendations can provide some anecdotal information that sometimes counselor recommendations can't.
Got it. And so for thinking of which teachers you should ask,
Mhm.
is there any method to the madness there? Is it the nicest teacher? Should you always ask them? Is it teachers of certain subjects or certain years of school? Are there any guidelines that students should be thinking about in terms of who to ask?
Definitely guidelines. It doesn't have to be the nicest, and I think that's something that a lot of students gravitate to. When I was sitting in the counseling chair, I would have, there were some usual suspect teachers, right? All students would say, "Oh, I'm asking from Mr. So and so or Ms. So and so." Everybody wanted these certain teachers to write for them, and I would always say, "Well, why? Why them? Oh, they're really nice, or they're really friendly." I'd say, "Yeah, but what do they know about you?"
Right.
Because that's the important thing to think about when you're the student. Think about which teachers, I'll say teachers plural, right? Who knows you best?
Right.
Who would have the most to say, and could give the most depth to something important about you academically? And that can be something good about you academically,
Mhm.
or something about you that maybe is a work in progress. Like, case in point, if I have a student who's maybe been struggling in a subject and maybe didn't do so well, but kind of muddled through it and sort of figured their way out, but
Mm.
maybe they don't have the greatest grade as a result of
Mhm.
having not done really well in the beginning. That could actually be a great teacher perspective, because the teacher could talk about, well, hey, they didn't start off on the best foot, or this was really tough for them, but I was really impressed with how they stuck it out, or how they, you know,
Right.
always, made sure to follow up with me and correct anything that was wrong. And, it made me feel more confident in the student's abilities as the semester went on, or as the year went on. So that could actually be a great perspective to show. So it doesn't always have to be the teacher who gave you in whose class you earned the A, right?
Right. I
Yeah.
love that. That's a really interesting perspective because I feel like students would tend to be hesitant if they didn't get a particularly good grade in the class. They wouldn't want to highlight that. But I think that's such a good perspective that that class where you had to work really hard, that teacher might have the best things to say about you, more so than the teacher of the class where things just came really easily to you.
Correct,
Right.
correct. I
Yeah.
think there's also a myth, or maybe a belief on some students' parts, that they need to ask for recommendations from teachers in subject areas that they might be considering studying in college. And it does not have to be, unless the school stipulates. If a program you're applying to is stipulating that, oh, you have to have a letter from a math teacher or whatever. But usually that doesn't happen, except in very rare cases. Military academies have some specific
Mhm.
requirements of who their letters come from, but most other schools and most other programs don't. So it's okay if you're looking at more of a STEM related subject, but wow, hey, you did so well in French, and your
Mhm.
French teacher has taught you for 3 years or maybe 4 years, and that person knows you really well, and you're
Yeah.
active in the French club or whatever it is. That would be a great recommendation for you to have, if it's a person who can really share insight into who you are, your
Mhm.
character, not just your abilities, but who you are as a student, as a person. Because the letters of recommendation are meant to help make a student three-dimensional in the
Right.
application. The numbers are the numbers, the GPA and the test scores, if you're submitting them, they are what they are. And they're forming a certain picture of you, the readers are getting a certain sense of you from those. But the letters help to drive things home, help to make you stand out
Mm.
beyond the grades, beyond the numbers, and help readers
Right.
better understand you.
And is there any restriction in terms of the year or years the teacher taught you? Should you be asking someone who taught you in freshman year of high school?
Not optimal. If
Yeah.
if the only time they ever taught you was in ninth grade, it's not a great idea, because the perspective is of, think of that. Who were you in ninth grade? You
Mm.
were new to high school, finding your way.
Yeah.
You've matured over the course of the last 3 years. My favorite group of teachers to go to for recommendations would be the junior year teachers, because they will have just come off teaching you from either the last semester or year right
Mhm.
before you're applying, and their perspective is pretty fresh. Or somebody maybe who did teach you back as far as freshman or sophomore year, but who is teaching you again in senior year, like you
Mm.
have this teacher again as a 12th grader. That could be an interesting perspective, because they can talk about the young version of you and the growth that they're seeing, because I can virtually guarantee they're not going to write this letter before fall. And I
Mhm.
can tell you that from having worked in a school setting for 11 years, and having had to track down friends of mine on the faculty who I knew owed me letters of recommendation, and this is not to scare anybody, but it would be October and I knew application deadlines were coming, and I would be walking down the hall and I would see my friend, oh, there's Joe. And wait, there Joe went. He saw me. I know he saw me, but because
Uh-oh.
he knows I know he owes me letters of
Yes.
recommendation. So it happens, but so many of them won't write these letters until fall anyway. So if they're teaching you again in 12th grade, they have the opportunity to see the modern day version, the contemporary version of
Right.
maybe that ninth grader they once knew.
Got it.
Yeah.
And now that you mentioned they will likely not be writing the recommendations till fall, should you be waiting to ask them until fall, or is that
No.
something that juniors should be thinking about now?
Juniors should definitely be thinking about this now, and there are a couple of reasons. One, a lot of teachers don't have the capacity to write dozens and dozens or
Mm.
hundreds, let's say, of letters of recommendation. They might say, look, I have a family, maybe they just had a child, or they've got something going on at home, or they work a second job, or they coach a sport, or they're busy and they can't always say yes to everyone. So they might say, all right, the max number of students I can write for this year is 20. And if you are the 21st person to ask me, I'll see what I can do, but I don't know if I can do it. And they're not doing that to be mean, but in all fairness, they want to be able to devote the time they need to this.
Of
Right.
course, yes.
So spring is a good time to ask, get their buy-in. Like I said, they're not going to write it now. They're probably not going to write it in the summer, but at least get on their short list and follow up with them in the fall to say, just wanted to check in, how was your summer? Let's chat. Is it still okay? Are you still able to write my letter of recommendation for college this year?
That's great advice. And I love the point that teachers are people too, who
Mhm.
have their own lives and families outside of school.
Yes.
So it's great for students to keep that in mind as they're asking teachers for recommendations,
Yeah.
that you can't ask them one day and expect it to be done the next.
Mhm.
Give a nice bit of notice and be nice and polite about it. I think will serve you well in this process. Now, how about the counselor recommendation? I know that school counselors have a lot on their plate, and the college process is just one part of that for many school counselors.
Mhm.
And I think the latest stats I read said that in the United States, the average student to counselor ratio is over 400 students per one counselor.
It can
And
be.
so if you're attending a school with that kind of ratio or worse, the school counselors aren't going to know every student. The school counselors try their best, but it's a very, very hard job with a lot on their plate. As a student, I think students get nervous about that. My school counselor doesn't even know me. What are they going to write? And is that going to put me at a disadvantage in the admissions process?
Absolutely not. First of all, colleges are aware of the fact that
Yeah.
counseling caseloads are high. And one of the questions that a counselor has to respond to on a form called the secondary school report is how many students in this class, right? And
Ah,
so, there used to be questions on those forms that asked about, how many counselees do you have? And so they know, colleges will
yes.
know, readers will know, and so they're not expecting them to know you very, very well. But there are mechanisms in place. A lot of counselors will have students fill out a sort of like an evaluation form on themselves. Some of them call it a brag sheet, quote unquote,
Mhm.
just questions about themselves that will help the counselor better craft that letter of recommendation. And yeah, some of them might have a boilerplate they use, and they might cut and paste some same phrases. And again, that's not going to hurt students. Colleges will look to the teacher recommendations for the more, you know, original, in-depth, perspective, and the counselor letter just to kind of say, okay, where does the student fall within the realm of their academic, their graduating class and their high school, and there might be some little pieces of information that the counselor can insert in there. And I don't
Mhm.
want to say it's not important. I wrote those letters for 11 years and I believed they were important, but I also had an advantage. I was only the college counselor. I was not the
Yes.
school counselor, guidance counselor. I was, just that was
Mhm.
my one and only role in that
Right.
school, and it was my job to write those letters and to be as particular as I could be. And I spent a lot of time crafting them. But not everybody can do that, and you're not at a disadvantage if your counselor can't do that.
Perfect. And is there anything that students have to do? We talked about how to ask your teachers to write a recommendation. Do you have to ask your school counselor, or is
You
that
shouldn't have to.
automatic?
You shouldn't have to. That's in a counselor's job description. It's just sort of generally understood that counselors are writing letters of recommendation for each of their students. That's just what happens. Uh, it, Counselors, though, may need students to let them know, or should need students to let them know when their deadlines are, what schools they're applying
Ah,
to. And a lot of
yes.
times that'll happen through a program like Naviance or SCORE, if the school uses one of those, or some internal tracking system. So my advice to students with regard to their counselors is just be aware of, what the procedures are.
Right.
Look at the counseling webpage, because there's probably information there, and there might be something like an assembly at the beginning of school in 12th grade. I
Mhm.
always did that with my 12th graders, just, brought everybody in, parents and students, and said, okay, here's how we're doing it. Process is starting here for applying to colleges. Follow these steps. These are your deadlines for me. And many counselors will have a deadline for notification from the student of where they're applying and what their deadlines are fairly well in advance of the actual deadline, so that the
Good.
counselors can get all the documentation together that they need
Yep.
to get to send it, whether they're sending it electronically or by mail. They need a little bit of lead time. You can't tell them, oh, my deadline is tomorrow, and expect
Yes.
them to get it out.
Got it.
Mhm.
Now, we talked about how some colleges don't require any recommendations, some it's counselor and maybe a teacher or two.
Mhm.
Can you or should you submit any more recommendations if you have other people in your life that you think would recommend you to a college? Is there a reason to? Is it even possible to submit supplemental recommendations?
It is possible. There are some schools that will allow it and some won't provide that. You'll see, for example, schools on the common application might allow you one additional letter of recommendation or two
Mhm.
additional letters of recommendation. It's not an absolute necessity. And to be honest, every internal admissions program, the director of admission will say to the staff at the beginning of application reading season, these are the things that you absolutely must read in every student's application. And here are the things that you can read if you have time. And usually the supplemental letters of recommendation are the read if you have time. And I'm not going to say that they never factor in, because sometimes they might, if
Mhm.
an applicant is on the fence, right? And an admissions committee is trying to decide, should we or shouldn't we admit, that could be the, oh, some other piece of information from this additional letter of recommendation helped us better understand them. But I tell students, be smart about it. Don't have many additional letters of recommendation. If there's one extra person, like a supervisor from a job, or somebody who's overseen something that you've done in your extracurriculars in a really deep way, that might be a nice extra voice. But don't think that it's necessary.
Right.
It just might be a nice extra touch to include, and they may or may not read that. So
Ah, yes,
it's
because
important to
admissions
focus on
counselors
the.
are people too
Yeah.
with lives, and they can't
Well,
read 20 letters of
and it's,
recommendation for each student.
yeah, beyond the fact, having a lot of admissions people will tell you they don't have lives during reading season. All they
Right,
do is read, but
right.
they have some have a quota, or they have to make it
Mhm.
through a certain number of applications in a time frame, because they have to start meeting in committees and deciding on those applications. So they don't have all the time in the world to read these things.
Right. So only if it adds something, don't feel like it's necessary.
Right, right.
Right, right. And just to wrap up, because it's now mid-April,
Mhm.
seniors are making decisions. I'm going to throw you a softball question. I'm going to lead the jury.
Okay.
Should seniors who are now making their college decisions, is there anything they should say to their teachers and counselors who wrote them recommendations at this point?
Oh, yes. Thank you. I would
Yes.
have had them thank the teachers before that.
Mhm.
It's not contingent upon getting into college, right?
Right.
It's once the application
Right.
process is going through, they've sent their applications. That's a nice time to thank their teachers for writing their letters. So a teacher doesn't feel like, well, this is determinant on, whether the student gets in or not. It's just the
Right.
fact that I did this
That you
for
did
them
it.
and they're thanking me. But now
Yeah.
is a really nice time for seniors to thank their teachers and counselors again, because they do work hard and they do what they can to promote that each student and their interests and their desires and their goals.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great message to leave folks with. And I know we have lots of school counselors who also listen to the show. So
Mhm.
Lisa and I will give an extra thank you to all the school counselors out
Yes.
there who we know are working
School
hard right now.
counselors, I know what you're going through, and I know it's not easy, but it's also rewarding on so many levels. So keep doing what you're doing.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us today and being my very first guest. And I learned a ton, and I'm sure our listeners did too. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Have a great day and great rest of your show.
Thank you. And listeners, we're going to take a quick break, but come back and we're going to answer your listener questions.